Daniel didn't cry at his father's funeral. He just sat there, expressionless, surrounded by hollow condolences and the fading scent of wilted lilies. A week earlier, his company had gone under. 3 days after that, his girlfriend packed up her things and left him a note: "I can't love someone who's sinking." Everything collapsed like a building imploding from the inside, no explosion, just dust and a deafening silence. And in that silence, Daniel started driving, no destination, just the certainty that he couldn't stay. 3,000 miles. 5 days. 6 gas stations and one night passed out in his car somewhere in the Utah desert. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't posted on social media, hadn't answered a single email. Every day, he just drove, letting the hum of the engine drown out everything inside. But silence wasn't peace. Silence was the empty space between unspoken questions. What should I have done differently? Was it my fault? If Dad had lived a little longer, would I have made him proud? By the time he reached Montana, dawn had painted the old pine ridges gold. Something in him paused, not because of the view, but because of the strange feeling that he had somehow slipped outside his own life. He stopped in a small lakeside town, the kind so quiet it barely made the map. The cafe had 3 people. The gas station sold popcorn and fishing bait. But something in Daniel slowed down. That's when he saw the older man sitting on a weathered wooden bench by the lake, one hand holding a paper coffee cup, the other clutching a black notebook, its corners worn soft. No one sat with him. No one interrupted. The lake was still as glass, and the man seemed like part of the landscape, not a visitor, but rooted here. Daniel didn't know why he walked over. He just knew that, for the first time in weeks, he sat down without needing a reason. And the old man, without even looking at him, tore a page from the notebook and held it out with a lightly trembling hand. Not a single word. Daniel took the paper with both hands, as if it were something fragile that needed to be handled with care, even though a part of him remained skeptical. On the paper, there was only a single handwritten line, the black ink smudged in places. What you abandon doesn't disappear. It waits. No signature. No explanation. Just that one sentence, like a message dredged up from a strange dream. Daniel read it over and over but felt nothing. No sudden clarity. No healing. Just a cryptic line, hanging in the air like his life at the moment. The old man remained where he was, still not looking at Daniel, not asking anything. Daniel didn't leave either. He sat there the entire morning on that second bench, beside a lake still as glass, with only the wind hitting the rocks like the breath of something older than language. In the days that followed, Daniel kept coming back, not because he understood, but because he didn't. Each time, the old man, Elijah, as the locals called him, would hand him another slip of paper, always with a short message. No lectures, no parables, no instant epiphanies. One afternoon, the note read, "Peace doesn't come when you seek it. It comes when you stop running from the noise." Daniel laughed. Not because the sentence was funny, but because it felt like he was being called out gently, but with precision. So what am I supposed to do? Just sit here until it magically works, he thought, irritated. That night, in the small cabin he'd rented near the lake, Daniel emptied his backpack, laid out all the slips of paper on the table. They didn't form a story. Just scattered pieces, full of gaps. And then a thought flickered through his mind. Maybe the gaps were the point. Maybe that's what the old man wanted him to see. But what he was supposed to see, he still didn't know. The next morning, Daniel didn't return to the bench. He was tired of the endless silence, the cryptic scraps of paper, and the old man who never even bothered to look him in the eye. Instead, he wandered around town, sat for a while in the little cafe, then drove aimlessly into the outskirts, where the fields stretched so far it felt like the world just gave up on ending. And then came the anger. Angry that he'd believed this place might calm him. Angry that Elijah just sat there like some mute sage, no words, no smiles, barely even breathing. But mostly, angry at himself for being weak enough to cling to scraps of paper and a stranger in the first place. By late afternoon, Daniel returned to the lake. Elijah was already there, sitting on the bench like always. This time, when the old man held out another piece of paper, Daniel didn't take it. "I don't need another one of your vague philosophies," he snapped. "They don't change anything. I've lost everything, and those little notes don't make it better." Elijah said nothing. Just gave a slight nod, like he heard but didn't argue. Daniel snatched the paper anyway, crushed it in his hand, and stood. He walked straight to the edge of the lake, where the wind had picked up, and threw the wad into the water. It floated for a moment, spun a few times, then slowly began to sink. That night, the first storm of the month rolled in. Wind screamed through the cliffs, rain fell like a waterfall, and thunder cracked across the lake. In the cabin, Daniel couldn't sleep. His mind kept echoing his own words, "They don't change anything." But then, sometime around midnight, he dreamed. He saw himself as a child standing in the middle of a heavy downpour, soaked to the bone, holding a paper boat. The boy didn't speak. He just looked at Daniel, eyes wide, waiting as if willing him to remember something vital he'd forgotten long ago. When Daniel woke, he didn't cry. But something inside him had broken open, not painfully, but light as a first breath after coming up from underwater. The next morning, the sky was the color of cold ash. Raindrops still clung to the pine branches, and the lake rippled softly, catching a quiet, silvery light. Daniel woke not because of an alarm, but because something in his chest stirred, not pain, but a need to understand. He threw on a jacket and headed quickly toward the lake. The old bench was still there. But this time, Elijah wasn't. The seat was empty. Only the weathered black notebook sat on the bench, its pages fluttering in the breeze. No sign of the old man. No one in town seemed to know where he'd gone. Daniel sat down for the first time in days, without expecting anything. His hands opened the notebook almost by instinct. Among the hundreds of handwritten pages, there it was, the crumpled note he had thrown into the lake. Now dry, flattened between two pages. Someone, Elijah, without a doubt, had fished it from the rain, kept it, and carefully written a line beneath the original. "You threw it because you were angry. I kept it because I understood." Daniel sat still. And slowly, the scattered pieces began to thread together. Elijah wasn't some healer. He was someone who had walked through storms. Someone who had once been angry, who had once thrown things away before he understood them, then came back to retrieve them. Not because they were sacred, but because he had made them sacred through his own breaking and mending. Daniel bowed his head. No tears. No dramatic wave of emotion. Just a moment real and quiet, so deep it made his heart go still. And then something strange happened. A small sparrow, feathers still damp from the rain, fluttered down and landed gently on his hand. It trembled, but didn't fly away. And Daniel, without knowing why, lifted his other hand to cradle it carefully, as if holding a part of himself that had just returned from a long, long journey. The sparrow stayed in Daniel's hand for a while, long enough for its tiny warmth to seep into his palm. It said nothing, of course, but its presence slowed the storm that had been swirling inside him. As if, for just one breath of time, the universe had agreed to be still with him. When it flew away, Daniel remained seated, his hand resting gently on the black notebook, a quiet kind of promise. He didn't know if Elijah would ever return. But something inside him whispered, it didn't matter anymore. What he had come here looking for, peace, stillness, healing, had never been in the scraps of paper or the words written on them. It had only arrived when he finally stopped long enough to realize he'd been trying to escape himself. Daniel didn't leave the town right away. He kept the cabin. Started waking early, brewing coffee, and sitting by the lake with a new notebook in hand. For the first time in years, he wrote, not for income, not for content, not for anyone else, just to figure out what he was really thinking. What he was really feeling. Every few days, someone new would appear at the lake. A divorced woman, running from the wreckage. A college dropout, unsure of what he wanted. A middle-aged man recently laid off by AI, questioning his worth. They all carried the same look, the gaze of someone who had wandered too far and didn't know the way back. Daniel didn't try to fix them. But sometimes, if one of them stayed long enough, he'd quietly tear a page from his notebook, write a single sentence, and hand it to them, just as Elijah had once done for him. One evening, as the sun skimmed the edge of the lake, a young man sat beside him, eyes rimmed red. Daniel didn't ask why. He simply tore a page, wrote a few words, and passed it over. You're not lost. You're just not done remembering who you are. And then one day, Daniel no longer needed to write. Not because he had found all the answers, but because he finally understood. Sometimes, the deepest truths don't live in words. They live in the moments we grow quiet enough to hear ourselves. He still lived by the lake. Not as a hermit. Not as someone who had figured it all out. But simply as someone who had learned how to stay. Stay with the questions. Stay with the silence. Stay with the things that didn't need to be solved right away. The bench was still there. The new notebook still had empty pages. But the difference now was this. Daniel no longer waited for peace to come to him. He carried it with him, day by day, through the quiet rhythm of how he chose to live. And if you are tired, if you're wondering what you've lost along the way, remember this. Maybe you don't need to keep searching. Maybe you just need to go back to where you once threw away a part of yourself. And if today you can only do one thing, sit down, be still, and listen.